LLSP alumni to our October Lunch and Learn program. October is Domestic Violence Prevention Month, and although KARAMAH no longer provides direct services to victims of domestic violence, we continue to offer technical support to organizations that provide direct services. Our guest today, Ms. Aisha Farooq, works for one such organization, the Asian Slant Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Research Project, DVRP for short. But before we get further into the program, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Ms. Farooq. Ms. Farooq is an LLSP alumna, class of 2016, and she previously spent an entire summer working as an undergraduate intern at KARAMAH. Ms. Farooq was born in the United States to Pakistani parents. She speaks Hindi and Urdu, which is very helpful to her in her work for DVRP. Ms. Farooq received her BA from the University of Virginia at Richmond, where she studied anthropology and PPEL, which translates to philosophy, politics, economics, and law. She's currently working toward her master's degree in public policy at George Mason University. Actually, Aisha, I didn't ask you, what's the topic of your master's degree?
Sure, so it's a master's in public policy, and then I'm focusing on social policy.
Do you have like a case study in mind? What do you mean by social policy?
Yeah, so you can go in various directions with social policy, but for me personally, I'm interested more so in like housing, or for example, like there's lots of courses that you can dabble in, but for me, it's more like affordable housing because it relates to DV survivors. So that's an interesting topic to me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so Aisha, leaving you for the moment, tell us a bit about DVRP, some history and how it works.
Sure. So the Asian Pacific Islander Domestic Violence Resource Project, we call it DVRP for short, was created in 1996. The organization was initially created by survivors and it was volunteer-led until 2013. So people would have like full-time jobs and then they would do this after their full-time job. So, if a client needed to have court accompaniment, volunteers were doing this. And then slowly we got funding and then case managers were brought on board. So I'm one of the South Asian case managers. So the order that we onboarded case managers was first we had a Japanese case manager, then a Vietnamese case manager, then a South Asian case manager, and then I think our Chinese case manager came on board. And I can tell you a little bit about the structure and the dynamic of the team. So we have case management, which is known as the Survivor Services Program. So our job is to basically provide direct services to survivors, but we do it in a very special way. So we understand that cultural and language barriers can be problems for clients. And back when the organization was being created, they did a survey in the community and they found that, domestic violence is happening. The reason why it's being underreported is because cultural and language barriers are in the way. They're barriers. So, when you do provide a contact number to a client, like, here's the immigration attorney you can contact. If they have several options, like click 1, click 2, put your phone number in, someone who has a language barrier will have a tough time getting a hold of an attorney. So, our job is to make sure that they're able to get the service and that's not a factor in them accessing the service. And another thing that I see, and this is why it's so important to bridge the language and cultural barrier, is that it's a whole different court system here. Even the public benefit system is like very different from the country they're coming from. So it's really important that you explain what you're referring them to. Like, for example, the way that the court looks at like a mother and father is 50-50% in a different country, it might be different. So you really have to break that cultural barrier they're coming from, so it doesn't create a gap in between the relationship between the attorney and the client. So that's one specific example of like how we bridge cultural and language barriers in the legal system. Some of the other things that we also work on is like, for example, if we find that an attorney is not understanding a client's like cultural or religious background, we kind of explain like, hey, I think this is why you're getting the question over and over again from the client. This is like what she's thinking. This is where she's coming from. So we also do it vice versa, the other way around. We also provide like referrals to shelters, housing, immigration attorneys if they need it. We also work with other mainstream providers to also bridge that cultural and language barrier gap. In addition to this, we also have an outreach team. So they do a lot of training with the community. They do it with a lot of universities, educating them on cultural humility and what we do as well. That's a quick snapshot.
Interesting. That's a quick snapshot. It occurs to me to wonder, do you know some of the people who were there from the beginning of DVRP? Are they still working with DVRP?
So I've had an interesting history with the organization. So I was actually I was an undergraduate intern for KARAMAH, which I'll get into later. That's how I initially found out about DVRP. So some of the people that I still knew as an intern or knew of by face are still there. So it's interesting. And it's a very small DV community. Like I know, for example, when I'm making like cold calls, I'll explain what we do. And, once or twice I've gotten the answer like, no, I know exactly what you do. I was actually a part of your board, or I was actually volunteering with your organization. So that's always like neat to see.
Because it seems to be quite a unique focus at DVRP on, linguistic and cultural competence for people who are providing the services. So I was just wondering whether anybody in the organization, in the founding generation of the organization, had personal experiences either as an attorney or a social worker with other organizations who were not able to provide services in an effective manner and have enough people who had the specific language and cultural skills. Really, the DVRP model I think, is quite unique. It's very interesting. Now, how is it that you do your fundraising? You said cold calling. Is that how does DVRP do its fundraising mostly?
Yeah. So just going back to the cold calls. So I mean that sometimes we do run into issues where legal representation is exhausted. For example, we've reached out to all the pro bono organizations in Virginia. So that's when I do try to reach out to private attorneys and explain like, this is what DVRP does. Could you assist our client like pro bono on legal representation? So we do have to do a lot of cold calls. So when you exhaust the mainstream pro bono organizations, I do try to see if there is anything else that can be done or new partnerships that can be made. So that's what I meant by cold call. Sorry.
By cold calling. Okay, so you're cold calling for service providers, but getting back to how do you raise funds? Obviously, you're serving a community which, for the most part, it doesn't have a lot of money, and even when a woman does successfully transition to life on her own, it may be a while before she's able to, give back to DVRP or similar organizations. So where does the fundraising for DVRP mostly come from?
Yeah. And so I can't speak too much on that just because I'm only doing direct services. But I know just generally speaking, we do get grants from government organizations, and we get some of the mainstream like funds that are set up. But in terms of personally fundraising, like our board of directors take care of that. I'm more so on the direct services side.
So speaking of direct services, I noticed when we talked before, you said something about a summer art therapy program. Tell me more.
Yeah, sure. So right now, due to COVID, we haven't been able to do it in person. We've been able to have remote workshops, but I can tell you more about how we used to do it in person. So we would have like a facilitator come in, mostly from the API community. So one interesting one that I was actually a part of, and usually the staff try to be a part of the trauma series. Like for example, we had one facilitator come in and, work with our clients. It's open to the community, but we really want to focus on our survivors. So like we would provide transportation if they needed an interpreter, like one of the case managers would be on site. So like, for example, it wasn't a hindrance when you were doing the series. So we had someone who came in and taught us how to do mandalas from like magazines and just cutting and pasting. And I think it was really nice just because when you're constantly going through the public system or public benefits and just focusing on like, okay, how do I get the service or referrals to get out of my situation? sometimes you don't take enough time out for yourself and do something fun. So I thought it was nice that, survivors could have that space and time to just, let go of their stress and just do a fun, mindless activity sometimes.
Mhm. So ideally, if we were not in COVID, you would have run, is it how many weeks, or how do you structure it exactly? Is it
Yeah,
weekends or?
yeah, we typically try to be mindful of like working hours. So we do it in the evenings during the weekday.
Mhm.
We definitely try to switch it up too. I know we've had some workshops on the weekends during the day, so
Mm.
it doesn't conflict with work schedules. Um, we would find a local area in DC, and then I know we've also done a local area in Maryland. We've tried to make sure it was accessible to like public transportation.
Mhm.
So just being very mindful, like where the location where we're doing it, and making sure that it's spread out because we serve DC, Maryland, and Virginia. And although we're
Mm.
centered in DC, we wanted to make sure all of our clients get a chance to do it.
Yeah. I'm a big proponent of arts and helping people to deal with trauma. So I just thought that was a really interesting sort of program that you do. So thank you for the overview. And now let's try to personalize it a bit, without, going into people's details. Could you share with us some stories, or do you see common threads, and common problems in the community that you serve?
Yeah, sure. I can kind of talk about some of the trends that we've been seeing, just like with COVID or just in general. So again, I'm like the South Asian.
Let's start, as they say, with the general, and then we'll move to the particular.
Okay, sure. So just like some of the general trends that I've seen. And do you want me to speak more about the general trends we've seen since COVID, or just like generally speaking?
Generally pre-COVID, and then what you've observed since COVID.
Mhm. Sure. So we serve like a pretty specific like immigrant population, whereas sometimes, life skills, like that term is thrown around, but I think it's really important to meet a client and see where their definition of life skills are. So,
Mm.
for example, we might have survivors who feel comfortable calling and are familiar with like the relationship like an attorney has with them, or for example, they're comfortable like navigating with emails. And if we have clients that have never created an email, are not comfortable making calls by themselves. So we really work with them to be on a phone call and then teach them, like, this is how you can introduce yourself. This is how you can ask for the service or ask for more information. Some clients are more comfortable just always like speaking on the phone. Sometimes, um, you know, writing an email becomes a barrier. So we
Mm.
do try to meet them where they are in terms of their definition of life skills.
Mhm.
Um, Another trend that I've seen, um, so I think this is just generally speaking, not just with the South Asian population that I serve, but just generally, um, with with a survivor coming from an APA background. Sometimes it's a whole extended family that they could be residing with, or even if they're not residing with, they're just connected with. So
Mm.
whatever their decision they're contemplating on taking, the whole community or their immediate or extended family has feedback on. So all of that, we try to work with them and say, is this something that you want to do? Is this something you're getting community feedback? Is this something like, families giving you pressure on? We have to be very mindful of like that dynamic. They're coming from an extended family background, and
Mhm.
decisions are made differently, feedback's given differently.
Mhm. So it sounds like you must have a very detailed intake checklist where you're trying to map out a
Mhm.
lot of, I guess, sort of the emotional and physical map
Mhm.
of where your client is. Would that be a fair way of putting it? So a lot of information about where they're situated mentally, physically.
Yeah. I think our focus is to make sure that the client feels comfortable with the information they're giving us. So we don't want to do too much of a detailed intake with them.
Mhm.
We just want to let them tell us however much they feel comfortable with. And because there's no time limit for us to work with
Mhm.
them on, It's not for a year or it's not for a couple months. It's however long they want to continue working with us. So we can learn other information about them, or they can open up to us to us much later. So we definitely try to keep the focus on like comfort and making sure it's survivor centered, the process. I think you can learn more about the dynamics and about them as a person later on throughout the process of providing services.
But I would assume, because you work with the client from the time you get their case to the time it's hopefully resolved, that over time you do end up building up a pretty detailed mental map of that person in their context.
Right. And it's really neat to also see how much progress the client makes as well. And, just to always remind them, I remember when you first came to me, we were still navigating emails, and now you're, typing emails out on your own. So just reminding of those like little milestone achievements is also really important.
I'm just curious, how would a client find you? It must be word of mouth. I mean, if you're dealing with a largely immigrant community and somebody whose maybe command of English isn't so good, where do they hear about DVRP?
Yeah, sure. So we try to be strategic in how we leave information about DVRP. So like, for example, we translate the information in different languages, and we might put them in mosque spaces. Sometimes in like women's bathroom stalls, you might see our information because that's a very private space. And so that's where information can be accessible. Or sometimes like ethnic grocery stores, like South Asian grocery stores, for example, or other Asian grocery stores, just leaving our information there. So making sure it's accessible in different spaces as well. But also our partnering organizations also refer us out. So for example, attorneys do know about us. So for example, if they see there's a client from a certain background and they're asking for other services outside of their scope, they'll refer us to them.
Well, it's always a problem. Okay, so now we have the general. How has COVID affected both how you provide services to people, but also maybe the prevalence of DV under COVID conditions?
So yeah, I think a lot of service providers have been commenting on this. We do see abusers, where they would be out of the home for 8 hours a day, and we would be able to speak to the client more openly at different points throughout the day. But with COVID and abusers staying home, I find that, a client might mention to me, I can only speak during this time period where it's a lunch break. So timings get very specific to narrow down. A client sometimes may mention that, I can't talk on the phone at all. I'm in the same home with them and it's a very small space. If it's not a house or if it's an apartment. So then we rely on like internet communication. So like emails, for example, or like messaging.
So I guess we have reason to be thankful that almost everybody has at least one cell phone now.
Yeah. And, I think you bring up like a really good point. Although, we do have cell phones, there's a lot of abuse that can occur with technology. So for example, we just have to make sure like phones aren't being tapped. We have to be really mindful of like caller ID. If someone is paying your cell phone bill, they can pull up like the ID records and see who you've been calling. So we do have to be very careful on how we're communicating. And that's why it's important, like when you are doing an intake or just working with any survivor in general, asking, is it okay for me to contact you? What is the best form of communication?
Yeah, I mean, it's really very sad, I have to say, how many people get stuck in this situation. One thing that we talked about earlier is the way in which many people who eventually, I suppose, become clients of DVRP find out that they've been divorced without their knowledge. Tell us a bit about that. That seems to be a recurring thread and a problem that your clients face.
Sure. So could you repeat that one more time? I think it cut out a little bit.
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, unfortunately for the recording, there's going to be gaps in the. Yeah, but I was asking about another common trend that you had spotlighted for me, which is some of your clients finding out that they've been divorced without any input from them into the process, either back in the home country or in some other way, and suddenly they're presented with divorce as a fait accompli.
Yeah, so I think I could just speak like just generally speaking from my like summer internships in the local courthouse and with KARAMAH and with DVRP. Like some of the common questions that I've just heard across the board is, for example, like debates on if someone has said "I divorce you" 3 times, how does that translate in the American court system? If you marry back home and you don't register the marriage here. Or how like or for example, if you get married in a masjid, like the paperwork for that to enter the marriage into the American court system. So I've gotten a lot of questions around that. And I generally, if there's a religious question on like, was that a proper divorce or not, I usually try to refer out to Peaceful Families or KARAMAH for further education. And as for, how does the divorce translate on the American court system? That's where we get in touch with an attorney. So we try to bridge the gap between the two and how it gets translated. Does that answer your question, Sarah?
Yes, but also I assume sometimes divorce goes the other way, which is to say you've got somebody who's been a victim of domestic violence who decides she wants to leave. So now she needs to be counseled through the a divorce in this country. And then I assume she would have religious questions about how that translates into whether or not she's considered divorced Islamically. So I guess this problem of trying to bring Islamic notions of divorce and the structure that they're dealing in here into some kind of congruity. Yeah. And have you seen a spike in rates of domestic violence since people got stuck in lockdown?
Yeah, I would definitely say there's been an increase in domestic violence as well. I think even if there necessarily isn't physical violence happening, because you have an abuser staying at home 8 hours a day, there's other ways they can control. For example, survivors have been told, like, if a survivor says, I'm going out for a walk or something, for example, the abuser can say, like, why are you going outside? It shouldn't take that long to, go to the grocery store and come back. So I think everything's very strictly monitored. And just like the stalking and like the not like isolating the survivor, not letting them speak to anything is a different layer of control and abuse. And I think that definitely causes a spike because it gets to a point where it's no longer controllable for the survivor. Other ways that we've seen a spike in DV case, or just another form of abuse that we have seen with COVID, is financial abuse. So I know our ED, Krithika Ghosh, had also mentioned how stimulus checks have been taken by abusers, for example. And in addition to that, like just even navigating how you apply for like unemployment financial assistance, that's been a huge barrier. So there's just been a lot of financial abuse due to COVID. That's also increased cases because it makes it that much more harder for survivors to leave their situations.
I would imagine that it's become harder in the current COVID environment to find transitional housing for people as well. But on the other hand, I'm imagining, correct me if I'm wrong, that being able to support your clients during hearings in courts a bit easier because many courts have moved to virtual hearings. Is that a fair way to say it? Housing is harder, but access to the courts is not so difficult?
Yeah, I do agree with you with housing. It's gotten a little difficult just because transitional housing, or even shelters for that matter, have to take precautions. So for example, you might have 2 survivors that could initially share a room can no longer share a room. They can only put one family in one room. And so therefore shelter space or transitional housing space gets more limited in that way. For court, I have seen it be easier in some ways. Clients don't have to figure out daycare for their children or transportation to courts. They can kind of have a remote hearing. I don't know if I can speak accurately for attorneys, but I'm assuming because court hearings are happening remotely, they might have more time to take on other cases, versus being limited to like 1 or 2 court cases or protective order hearings, just because they have to figure out transportation for themselves as well. So it's been harder, it's been easier in some ways in both those matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that saying that what COVID has done is it's made certain things harder and other things easier, it's probably right. Net result, probably zero change. So
Yeah.
turning back to the personal, Aisha, could you share with us how you found your way to DVRP? You gave us some hints before. I mean, what is it about working in this area that draws you? It's a very emotionally exhausting kind of work.
Yeah. So I had an interesting experience. So I, during my junior year of college, I interned at a local courthouse in juvenile and domestic relations court, where I saw all sorts of cases coming up, dealing with domestic violence, and there were families of all different cultures, all different backgrounds. So it was really interesting to see how like cultural and religious barriers get intersected with the American court system. And so there, I really wanted to understand, what about like Muslim families? There's a lot of religious Islamic laws. How do those get navigated in court? So I did see an attorney at KARAMAH in the local courthouse. And so she had introduced herself as being from KARAMAH. So when I later looked up the organization, I realized you all do education on this, on how like American law and Islamic law intersect, and they intersect and they collide. So then I decided to intern for you all during my senior year of college. So it was an interesting experience. I remember I also had gone to court. I had also seen that along with the attorney, there's another case manager, and it was from DVRP. And so she provides support on other services while the attorney is providing legal representation. So it seemed very interesting to me. And so I later kept the organization in the back of my head, and I, picked the case manager's head, and I was like, what do you do? How does this work? What do you do when this happens? And it seemed very fascinating. So then I came back to it after graduating from college.
And you've been working there now?
It'll be almost 2 years coming up in January.
Any idea of becoming a lawyer yourself at some point?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on it. It sounds like a really rewarding career. It also sounds like a really challenging career. I'm still considering it. I haven't made a firm decision on it yet.
We'll be following you with interest. So in closing, is there anything you want to say to our viewers about how they can become involved in preventing DV in their communities?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot that, domestic violence organizations can use support with. One plug that I just wanted to put in for DVRP, for example, with the COVID situation, we have children staying at home. There's been a lot more needs and asks just because there's been so much financial abuse with the stimulus checks being controlled. So if you want to get in touch about volunteering with us, or for example, donating like gift cards to clients that are in need at this time, I'm happy to get in touch with anybody who wants to do that. Or you can follow us on our website at dvrp.org.
Tell me more about the gift cards. How does that work?
Yeah, sure. So we do find, since our population is so specific, like for example, we have clients who might be vegetarians, we have clients who might can only eat halal foods. So sometimes we only get gift cards from mainstream grocery stores like Giant and Safeway, who can't accommodate those restrictions. So that's why we ask for donations of like gift cards, like plain Visa gift cards, for example, so the client can use it at whatever grocery store she prefers. And so we'll be doing this more towards the holidays, where we'll be making a call for anyone who wants to donate gift cards for our clients, specifically for food too.
Yes, I remember I used to give gift cards to my various nieces and nephews when they were students. They are very handy. So thank you then, Aisha, for this very interesting interview on such a sad and difficult topic. I do wish you all the best in your studies and in your life. I hope to see you at future KARAMAH programs. Is there anything else you want to say to anybody before I bring this interview to a close?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your time. If anyone has any additional questions, I'm happy to get in touch. My email is aisha@dvrp.org. I really appreciate you having me.
Good, you got the plug in. I like that. So now for my own quick plugs. As you know, the Lunch and Learn program normally takes place on the fourth Thursday of each month, but for November and December, we will be moving to the third Thursday of each of those months. So specifically, the next Lunch and Learn will be on the 19th of November, and the December Lunch and Learn will be on the 17th of December, respectively. And we're doing that to avoid running into Thanksgiving and Christmas. So please mark your calendars accordingly. Our guest for the November Lunch and Learn interview will be Ms. Sarah Dwyer-Schick. She's the founder of the Sports Bra Project. You can find the organization online at www.sportsbraproject.org. I don't want to tell you anything more about it because then I would spoil the surprise. This will be one of the first in an ongoing occasional series of interviews on leadership. I hope that you will join us on Thursday, the 19th of November, when Ms. Dwyer-Schick will tell us about how she saw a need and responded by trying to meet that need, which to me is the essence of leadership. So thank you all for coming, and I'll see you, inshallah, on the 19th of November.